The slap that shook a general, Patton, discipline, and the cost of command in Sicily. The Sicilian sun beat down mercilessly on the canvas tents of the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia in early August 1943. Dust hung in the air like a shroud, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp tang of disinfectant. Rows of wounded men lay on cots, their bandages stained, their moans a constant undercurrent to the distant rumble of artillery. Lieutenant General George S. Patton strode through the ward with his characteristic swagger, polished helmet, riding crop in hand, 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders. His presence alone commanded silence. Officers straightened. Doctors stepped aside. This was old blood and guts, the man who had driven 7th Army across the island in a race against Montgomery, the general who demanded victory at any price. He moved from bed to bed, praising the visibly wounded, shaking hands with those who had lost limbs but kept their fighting spirit. Then he stopped. Private Charles H. Cool, 1st Infantry Division, sat slumped on a stool. No obvious wounds, no blood. Patton's eyes narrowed. "What's the matter with you, soldier?" Cool looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I can't take it, sir. It's my nerves." The words hung in the stifling heat. For a split second, the ward seemed to hold its breath. Patton's face twisted in fury. "You yellow bastard," he roared. His gloved hand lashed out, striking Cool across the face. He grabbed the private by the collar, dragged him to the tent entrance, and delivered a sharp kick that sent the young man sprawling into the dirt. "Don't admit this, son of a bitch," Patton bellowed at the stunned medical staff. "You hear me? Send this gutless coward back to the front lines where he belongs." The general's voice echoed across the camp as he stormed away, leaving shocked silence in his wake. This was no isolated outburst. Just days later, at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, history repeated itself with Private Paul Bennett. Again, nerves. Again, the slap, twice this time, followed by threats and humiliation in front of witnesses. But why did these moments matter? Why did 2 slaps in a Sicilian field hospital threaten to derail the career of one of America's most brilliant and aggressive commanders? Because they cut to the heart of something far larger than personal temper, the brutal arithmetic of leadership in total war, the razor's edge between unbreakable discipline and human breaking point, and the question of what a commander owes his men when fear itself becomes the enemy. To understand the weight of Patton's actions, we must step back into the furnace of the Sicily campaign. Operation Husky had begun in July 1943 as the first major Allied return to Axis-occupied Europe. Patton's 7th Army landed at Gela under heavy fire, repelled fierce German counterattacks, and then unleashed a lightning drive across the island. His troops covered ground at a pace that shocked even their British allies. Messina, the prize, lay ahead, a symbolic victory that would trap Axis forces, but the cost was horrific. The rugged Sicilian terrain, relentless heat, malaria, dysentery, and determined German rearguard actions ground men down. Casualties mounted. Battle fatigue, what we now call combat stress reaction, or PTSD, spread through the ranks like an invisible plague. Soldiers who had stormed beaches and fought through olive groves suddenly found themselves unable to function. Some trembled uncontrollably, others simply shut down. In the American Army of 1943, shell shock, or battle fatigue, was still poorly understood. Official doctrine emphasized will and discipline above all. Retreat from fear was cowardice. Commanders like Patton, shaped by the trenches of World War I and a deep belief in martial tradition, saw it as a contagious threat to unit cohesion. If one man was allowed to break, others would follow. Victory demanded iron. Anything less invited defeat. Patton had made his views crystal clear in speeches to his troops before the invasion. You are not all going to die. Only 10% of you will be killed. The rest will be wounded or unhurt. But you must be willing to die if necessary. He drilled into officers the need for constant forward pressure. Hesitation killed more men than the enemy. Patton himself was no stranger to personal strain. He suffered from what he called nerves in private, yet mastered them through sheer force of will, constant activity, and an almost mystical belief in destiny and reincarnation. He carried pistols with ivory handles, quoted poetry, and saw war as the ultimate arena for proving manhood and honor. To him, the hospital wards represented not just medical stations, but potential leaks in the dam of discipline. If nervous cases were coddled, the fighting spirit of the entire army might erode at the moment of its greatest push toward Messina. This was the context in which Patton entered those tents, not as a tourist, but as a commander inspecting his front line machine, ensuring it did not falter. When Patton confronted Cool and later Bennett, he did not see traumatized young men in need of rest. He saw threats to the honor of the uniform, to the sacrifice of the truly wounded lying nearby, and to the momentum of his campaign. His reaction was instantaneous, visceral, and public. By dragging them out, humiliating them, and ordering them back to duty, he sent a message louder than any memo. There is no escape from the fight. Fear is not an excuse. The army marches or it dies. Officers present later recalled the stunned silence, the way doctors froze, the way word spread like wildfire through the ranks. Some soldiers admired the general's toughness, others whispered in horror, but everyone understood. Patton was watching. Yet this was only the spark. The real fire would come later, when the incidents leaked to the press and reached Supreme Command. Eisenhower, balancing alliance politics and public opinion back home, faced a dilemma. Patton was irreplaceable as a fighter, but dangerous as a symbol of unchecked brutality. The slaps nearly cost Patton his command. He was forced to apologize personally to the soldiers. He addressed his troops in a humiliating radio broadcast. For weeks, his future hung in the balance, and through it all, the deeper question lingered. In the furnace of war, can a leader afford mercy, or does mercy itself become the greatest cruelty? The days following the incidents passed in a haze of continued advance. Patton's 7th Army raced northward, capturing Palermo on July 22nd and pressing hard toward Messina. The general himself seemed undeterred, riding in open vehicles, exposing himself to fire, driving his men with the same ferocious energy that had defined his career. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Reports of the slaps filtered upward through medical channels. One doctor, outraged, documented the events in detail. Word reached Eisenhower's headquarters. The Supreme Commander, already juggling coalition tensions with the British and domestic political pressures, could not ignore what amounted to physical abuse of hospitalized soldiers. Patton, for his part, showed little immediate remorse in private writings. He viewed the episodes as necessary medicine. In his mind, the true scandal would have been allowing fear to spread unchecked. He had seen the devastating effects of shell shock in the First World War, men reduced to trembling wrecks, units that collapsed under pressure. Discipline, he believed, was the thin line separating civilized armies from mobs. There is only one proper way for a professional soldier to die, he once wrote, the last bullet of the last battle of the last war. Anything less dishonored the fallen and endangered the living. His harshness was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculated, almost religious devotion to the idea that will could conquer all. But the army was changing. By 1943, the flood of citizen soldiers, draftees, young men pulled from factories and farms, brought different expectations. They fought bravely, but they were not professionals steeped in the old martial code. Battle fatigue cases were rising across all theaters. Medical officers began arguing quietly that these men were not cowards, but victims of a new kind of industrial war. Endless artillery barrages, invisible trauma, bodies pushed beyond human limits. Patton's actions, dramatic and public, crystallized a larger tension within the American military. The clash between old school commanders who demanded Spartan endurance and a modern force confronting the psychological realities of mechanized slaughter. When Eisenhower finally confronted Patton, the meeting was tense. Ike, ever the diplomat, recognized Patton's genius for mobile warfare, but could not tolerate behavior that risked public scandal or eroded morale. A formal reprimand followed. Patton was ordered to apologize to Cool and Bennett personally. He did so, though accounts differ on the sincerity. To his troops, he delivered a radio address that bordered on the theatrical, acknowledging the need for compassion while reaffirming the necessity of toughness. Behind closed doors, he raged at what he saw as softness creeping into the ranks. His diary entries reveal a man convinced that only unrelenting pressure could win the war, and that he alone understood the price. The consequences rippled outward. For Cool and Bennett, the immediate aftermath was humiliation, followed by medical attention. Both men eventually returned to duty or were properly treated. Neither sought lasting revenge. But the story spread. Newspapers back home, hungry for controversy, would later sensationalize the slapping incidents, painting Patton as a brute. Congressional inquiries loomed. Eisenhower seriously considered relieving him of command. For months, Patton lingered in a kind of professional limbo, still in Sicily, still training troops, but sidelined from the grand invasion plans shaping in England. It was during this period of enforced reflection that his reputation as a loose cannon nearly ended his role in the liberation of Europe. Yet Patton refused to fade. He threw himself into preparations for future operations, visiting units, delivering blistering speeches, and maintaining the image of the indomitable warrior. His very presence, tall, imposing, with those piercing eyes and ivory-handled revolvers, reminded men that war was not a gentle enterprise. Officers who served under him later recalled how his standards, though brutal, produced results. Divisions under Patton advanced faster, fought harder, and took objectives that others deemed impossible. The slapping incidents, for all their ugliness, became part of the legend, proof that this general would not tolerate weakness, even at the cost of his own career. Deeper still, these moments expose the moral calculus every commander faces. War is not a place for pure mercy. A general who pities the broken too openly may doom the many. Yet a leader who crushes the human spirit risks becoming the very monster he fights. Patton embodied both extremes. He wept privately over casualties. He visited hospitals repeatedly, not just to police them, but to honor the wounded. He wrote letters to families of the dead, but in the heat of the moment, when confronted with what he perceived as surrender, his instinct was violence, swift, personal, exemplary. It was the act of a man who believed that one visible failure could unravel an entire army. In that belief lay both his greatness and his flaw. As Allied forces prepared to leap across the English Channel, Patton's future hung by a thread. Eisenhower, pragmatic as ever, kept him in reserve. The very qualities that made him dangerous, his audacity, his intolerance for hesitation, were the same ones the Allies would soon need desperately in the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The slaps in Sicily became a cautionary tale whispered in staff tents. Leadership demands strength, but unchecked strength invites ruin. Patton, chastened yet unbroken, waited for redemption. When it came, in the snows of Bastogne and the race across France, he would prove once more why armies followed him into hell. But the shadow of those canvas tents in Sicily never fully lifted. It asked a question that echoes through every war. How much of a man's soul must a general sacrifice to win, and how much of his soldiers' souls is he willing to break in the process? The incidents forced the U.S. Army to confront battle fatigue more systematically. Policies evolved. Rest camps, rotation, better psychiatric care, small steps born partly from the backlash against Patton's methods. Yet the core dilemma remained. In the final push against Nazi Germany, no one doubted that iron discipline had its place. Patton's troops, forged in that unforgiving mold, became the spearhead of victory. They moved faster, struck harder, and inspired legends. The general who slapped two frightened privates in the heat of Sicily would soon be the one liberating cities and crushing German armies. His contradictions defined him. The same hand that struck a soldier also pointed the way to victory. In the end, the slapping incidents did not destroy Patton. They tempered him in the public eye, but they also revealed the unyielding core that made him indispensable. By late 1944, when the Germans launched their desperate Ardennes offensive, it was Patton who pivoted his Third Army with breathtaking speed, relieving the besieged town of Bastogne and turning the tide in the Battle of the Bulge. The man who had kicked a soldier out of a Sicilian tent now drove through snow and ice to save thousands. The same iron will that once seemed cruel now became salvation. Eisenhower, despite everything, kept him in the fight because results mattered more than optics. Victory has a way of forgiving sins that defeat never could. Yet the episodes left a permanent mark on Patton's legacy. They humanized him in the harshest way, exposing the volatile temper behind the legend. The 19th century warrior thrust into a 20th century war where psychology began to rival firepower. Soldiers who served under him offered divided testimonies for decades afterward. Some called him a tyrant who demanded the impossible. Others credited him with forging them into killers who survived when softer commands would have led to slaughter. The truth, as always with Patton, refused to sit neatly in one camp. He was the general who wept at the graves of his men, and the same man who could not tolerate a private's trembling. His life became a study in the brutal arithmetic of command. How many must break so that the many might prevail? History has judged the incidents through the lens of evolving understanding. What Patton saw as cowardice, we now recognize as combat trauma. Invisible wounds as real as shrapnel. Modern militaries invest heavily in mental health precisely because ignoring it costs more lives in the long run. But context matters. In 1943, facing a fanatical enemy across unforgiving terrain, with supply lines strained and the outcome of the war still uncertain, Patton operated under different rules. Mercy for the few could mean death for the many. His methods, however ugly, reflected a worldview forged in bloodier wars, where hesitation invited annihilation. The slaps were not aberrations, they were the logical extreme of a philosophy that placed mission and honor above individual comfort. This single concrete episode, 2 tents, 2 soldiers, 2 sharp cracks of a gloved hand, reveals a deeper truth about war itself. War does not merely test men, it distills them. It forces commanders into impossible choices where every path carries moral cost. Discipline is the glue that holds armies together under fire. Yet discipline without humanity becomes tyranny. Patton embodied that tension more vividly than most. His greatness lay in his willingness to be hated if it meant winning. His tragedy lay in how easily that same willingness could cross into excess. One decision in the heat of a Sicilian summer nearly ended his war. Another in the frozen Ardennes helped shorten it. The line between hero and villain is often drawn by timing and victory. For the soldiers who witnessed those moments, the memory lingered. They carried it through Italy, France, and into Germany. Some despised Patton for it. Others respected the brutal honesty. This general would not lie to them about the nature of their task. War is not a game of fairness. It is fire and pressure that reveals what a man is made of. Patton demanded they prove themselves worthy of the uniform, even when their bodies and minds screamed otherwise. In doing so, he paid a personal price: public scorn, internal doubt, the slow erosion of his own reputation. But he never wavered in his belief that softness killed more surely than any German bullet. Today, as we look back across the decades, the image remains haunting. A 4-star general standing in a blood-scented tent, the sun beating down on canvas, the distant thunder of guns. A frightened private utters the forbidden words, "I can't take it," and the general's hand flashes out. In that instant, the entire machinery of war, with all its strategy and logistics, collapses into something raw and human. Power, fear, duty, rage, love of country, all concentrated in one violent gesture. It was never just about 2 slaps. It was about the price exacted by a system that turns ordinary men into weapons and demands their commanders become something harder still. Patton died in December 1945 after a car accident in occupied Germany, robbed of a grand battlefield death he had always imagined for himself. His passing closed one of the most dramatic chapters in American military history. But the questions he forced upon us remain open. What does true leadership demand in the face of fear? How much brutality can a just cause tolerate before it corrupts itself? Where is the line between necessary hardness and needless cruelty? Patton did not provide easy answers. He lived the contradictions so that others might study them. In the end, his greatest gift to history was not flawless victory, but the uncomfortable mirror he held up to the face of war, ugly, uncompromising, and relentlessly human. The tents in Sicily are gone now, swallowed by time and olive groves. Yet somewhere in the records, in the memories of old soldiers, and in the uneasy conscience of every commander who sends men into fire, those slaps still echo. They remind us that behind every legend of glory stands the brutal reality of decisions made under impossible pressure, decisions that saved nations while scarring souls. George S. Patton did not merely command armies. He commanded the truth about what war asks of those who wage it, and that truth, once seen, is impossible to forget.